Hello, everybody. Old Buck Dave back again with our 150th episode. And with me is Mr. You-know-who.
Mr. Old Buck Dale.
Mr. Old Buck Dale. Good to hear you.
150. Ooh.
150, yeah.
Who would have thunk it?
Yeah, I was reminded by VV1 that this will be our sesquicentennial episode. 150th sesquicentennial. Do you remember when West Newton had a sesquicentennial?
I do not know. That's not a word I use very often, so I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that was sometime in the 50s, I guess. And there were they had a wagon train and all that sort of thing. Anyway. So anyway, listen, hey, I'm in Chautauqua, New York right now. Beautiful downtown Chautauqua, where it's a sunny, brisk 60 degrees. And so where are you, Mr. Dale?
Well, I'm on the outer bands of the recent hurricane that just went through here. We just had a little blow by here a few minutes ago.
Yeah, give us a little update. Give us a little on the scene weather report in the middle of Hurricane Idalia.
Well, all I can tell you is it could be a lot worse. It could have been a lot worse. Having got through the outer bands of that Ian hurricane. Fortunately, it was a little bit further away from shore. There's a lot of shore damage or flooding, but inland of 5 or 10 miles, it wasn't too bad. But anything weak, all the little oak trees that need snapped off get broken down, and of course the whole thing is disruptive and it's scary. And when it happens in the dark, I think that's what's the worst case. I don't mind watching stuff, but when those storms hitting at night in the dark, it just I can't sleep. I'll probably nap after I get done talking to you. Otherwise, we live to see another day.
Live to see another day, yeah. But north of us, it's not so good. Not so good. I was just looking at a video on TV, Cedar Key, which is further up towards the Panhandle, and we'd been there. In fact, the video was inside a bar in Cedar Key. And there was beside the bar was a leg lamp, like they had in the Christmas Story. He had a lamp of a woman's leg. Anyway, My wife said, "Look, there's the bar. We were in that bar. We were sitting right next to that leg lamp, and the water is just up to the bar top level. Pretty scary."
No, another friend of mine asked me how I was doing, checking on me. I said, "I'm fine." I said, "But in these storms, somebody always gets it. Somebody always takes the brunt. It's just, not everybody is, dodges the bullet every time. It's not like it goes up into the sky and disappears. Somebody gets it. So best wishes to all those folks up there in the Panhandle.
Yeah.
I hope they cope."
Yeah. Speaking of spooky weather, last Thursday night, the Steelers played a preseason game. And of course, my sister and I are texting back and forth. She lives near Seven Springs Ski Resort in southwestern Pennsylvania. You know where that is.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, a tornado came through there, she said, right after the game. There were several injuries. There was a campground nearby where some people were tossed around pretty good and ended up in the hospital, unfortunately. She said she was okay, but they were trapped in their house till the fire department came and took out some trees that had come down around the house and around the driveway. So that was pretty scary. So they had no power for 5 days. So she said it was a kind of a scary time. And spookily, my son in Nashville lost his house in March 2020 in a tornado. So I don't know if it's genetic or what here, but it's kind of disturbing.
Well, you certainly beat the odds when it comes to close friends that have and relatives that have been involved in it. I've seen those mountain tornadoes. They do a lot of damage. They pick up those trees and anything loose, and they smash the heck out of everything. So
yeah,
all the best to your sister up there.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to the main act of today's episode. We've got Frank Young back. He was featured in episode 135, where he talked about his book, 47 Aerograms, where he spent the sophomore year of college in India. Well, we both read the book. I know I loved it. I know you loved it. We're going to put a link to it again. And so Frank is back to tell us about his career in the U.S. Foreign Service. I'm going to give you a little quick bio here, and then we're going to welcome Frank. So in his 35 years with USAID, Frank rose through the ranks from a junior program officer in the Philippines to the director of our USAID mission in Ghana. Then he was in Washington as a senior deputy assistant administrator in USAID's Asia and Africa bureaus. And he was acting administrator for Asia when he was called out of retirement in 2010. They just won't let him go. He was also director of USAID's program to bring about 1,100 new Foreign Service officers in 2011 to 2012. And he later taught global development to State Department officers at the George Shultz National Foreign Affairs Training Center. He was awarded the Distinguished Career Service Award when he left USAID, the highest recognition given to a retiring officer. Since then, he's monitored senior officers serving in our USAID missions abroad. So welcome back, Frank. How are you?
Oh, I'm just great. I'm sitting up here in Canada well, today it's cloudy, but we've been having beautiful weather, mid 70s. It's what's happening in Florida, which my hearts go out to those people in the Big Bend. But the contrast in weather conditions up here from down there is just remarkable. But it's great to hear your voices again. Del, I'm glad you came through it. And Dave, I'm glad you dodged tornadoes and made a safe trip to Chautauqua.
Yeah. Boy, what a time it's been. But hey, listen, now that you're here, tell us a little bit about the Foreign Service. You know, what's the mission there? What do you do? What do the people do in the Foreign Service? I mean, people know we have diplomats and blah, 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 but I don't know if people think a lot about what all's involved. So give us a little background story on what it's all about.
Yeah, it's in a way it's difficult to describe what Foreign Service officers do every day. It's a little easier to describe what our military does because they're constantly in training and preparation for fighting our nation's wars. But the Foreign Service, their job is actually to prevent and resolve conflict. It's to try and work to maintain positive relations with the countries in which they're assigned through our embassies and our consulates. Their job is one of sort of day-to-day building networks and building relationships and an atmosphere of trust between officials in the countries in which we're working. We negotiate peace deals. We promote trade and investment. We promote economic relationships. We work on transnational issues such as counterterrorism and counter drug programs. I mean, we're involved in just about every aspect of U.S. foreign policy, including military to military relations. We have a role in that as well. We're involved in just about every aspect of U.S. foreign policy because it is our job to not just help the president formulate that policy, but also to carry out that policy. And a lot of people really don't understand why they don't know more about what we do, because we do a lot of our work outside the spotlight. Our best work is actually done, frankly, in the shadows, because it takes time to negotiate agreements. It takes time to build those relationships of trust, to analyze a country's politics and economy so that our leaders in Washington can decide how best to manage our relationships with those countries. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to describe any given day, actually what it is we do. But I think people would be surprised to know that the size of our Foreign Service, which is about 16,000 people, plus 45,000 people who are employed locally in our embassies throughout the world. That number of people is spread over about 275 posts and offices worldwide. And we operate on a budget of about $60 billion, which, to put it in perspective, is less than 1% of the US federal budget and about 1/12 of what we spend on the military. You know, that kind of gives you an idea of the sort of the size of the package and what it is we do. I mean, ironically, in football games, NFL games on a Sunday, you'll see advertisements by the US Army that says, "Be all that you can be, join the Army." You'll never see the State Department or USAID or any of our foreign affairs agencies doing a similar advertisement. We just don't do it that way. We try to recruit through other channels. And frankly, we've been having a little trouble in recent years recruiting enough people to fill the ranks of our service.
Is that because people are not interested in going that route, or they don't understand enough about what the mission is? Or
It's a mix of all of that. I'm not going to try and be political here, but we saw a rapid drop off in applications for taking the Foreign Service exam between 2017, 2016 to 2020. We had about half the number of people taking the Foreign Service exam during those years. And that's continued, by the way, under the current administration, although the numbers are getting up. We've had half the number of people applying to take the exams as was the case, say, 15 years ago.
wow.
And so while we would have brought in maybe 1% or less than 1% of total applicants, now we're bringing in maybe 2 to 3% of total applicants because we need to fill the ranks. But trying to get people to take the exam, and particularly getting minorities to take the exam so that the service looks more like America, has really been a significant challenge for us.
I read Marie Yukanakovich's book. I'm sorry if I butchered her last name. The book.
Yeah, Marie Ivanovich.
Yes, great book. Great recommendation. Yeah, she also talked about some of the challenges of getting females and minorities into the Foreign Service. It was interesting.
When you started, I mean, it's a big difference between then and now. I think countries are, it was a little bit different in the world where the countries were a little more welcoming or something like that. Now, I mean, you were young, you wanted to travel. Maybe they don't see it that way now. Maybe it looks like it's more difficult. Maybe they don't want to travel.
I have seen that, Del. In fact, sort of linking back to the book, one of the reasons I wrote the book was because I wanted to create the curiosity and the interest in young people, college students in particular, to live and travel overseas. And what we've been finding is that sort of overseas study gap year or even semester abroad is becoming less and less popular with young people. And we just simply don't see that interest the way we saw it back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I'm not sure I can explain why, but young people today, particularly those entering the Foreign Service, during my time, we consider the Foreign Service a calling, a profession, a complete career. You didn't go in with the thought that you'd leave 10 years later, because to learn your trade craft in the diplomatic arts takes a decade or more. You can't even begin to think about being qualified to be an ambassador, career ambassador, before you've been in the service 15 years. Certainly to be an aid director overseas takes about that long. You need to learn it on the ground. And so it takes a commitment for the long term. And I think that's been one of the most difficult challenges in the Foreign Service, is to get, when people come in, to get them to think in terms of a 20 to 25 year career. Most occupations these days, there's a lot of churn. There are young people and professionals are constantly churning between jobs in different lines of professions in order to build a career. And the Foreign Service itself was always thought of to be a career and a profession in and of itself. And that's probably one of the hardest things to convince new entrants that this is something that they should consider a life's calling.
Hey, Frank, but were you single when you joined, when you got involved in this?
No, I was married. Unfortunately, I was divorced after the Philippines, and I met my current wife, Patricia, in India, actually, during my assignment in India, and we got engaged in India. We find that married couples are that's one of the biggest challenges is providing opportunities for spouses of married couples to actually have a career working overseas while their other spouse is actually serving in an embassy or an aid mission. A lot of the countries that I've been posted to, developing countries, they have strict work requirements where they don't allow spouses of foreign service officers to work on the local economy. And that's understandable. So our embassies have been trying to have spousal employee programs in order to incentivize spouses to accompany. Family life overseas is very, very difficult, potentially very, very difficult. And it is also for children as well. The adjustments back and forth between overseas assignments and then coming home and getting adjusted back to the States. It's a real drain on families. But I think it's important to have your family with you. Single people who are foreign service officers face their own unique difficulties. But I was glad I was married and actually started a family in the Philippines. My daughter is an adopted Filipino. We adopted her in 1980 in the Philippines. And I think that's probably the best thing I took out of my Philippine experience, was adopting my daughter.
That's sweet. Yeah.
Hey, Frank, I have a question. In your travels, you have met many, 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 many people. And I saw some correspondence between you and Dave. And one question was the most memorable character, the most memorable person. I'd be curious to hear that story. I mean, I know you've met lots and lots of people, distinguished people, presidents and whatever. But there was somebody mentioned them in Ghana or something?
Ghana.
Yeah, tell us about some of your most interesting people, most memorable people you've met. Go ahead. That's a great question, Dale.
I think for me, and it's hard to choose, but for me, the most memorable person is former President John Kufuor of Ghana. And it didn't start out that way. I mean, we became friends during my tenure there, and but it didn't really start out that way. And the backstory to that is I arrived in Ghana on the day our embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam were blown up. And I was met at Plainside by armored cars and police escorts. And I knew that this was not an auspicious start to a 4-year assignment as director of our aid mission. A week later, the chargé d'affaires, who was the acting ambassador, threw a welcome reception for me at her residence. And as normal for protocol, you arrive half an hour early for your own reception because you want to be in the receiving line when people start arriving. So I arrive half hour early, and the chargé, I get out of the car and she comes up to me and she says, "Oh, I'm so embarrassed. I'm sorry. Somebody's already arrived and you have to meet him." And I said, "Oh, okay." So I grabbed a club soda, walked over to where the political counselor was, Stephanie Sullivan, who, by the way, later became our ambassador to Ghana, a decade or so later. She was talking to this gentleman, was about 6'4", 6'5", huge shoulders, broad head, bright smile, kind of droopy eyelids, and a baritone voice that it was just almost an operatic baritone voice. He just had a lovely voice. And I walked up to him and I said, "My name is Frank Young. I'm the new aid director here." And he took my hand in this massive hand of his, it's a huge paw, and he held it and he said, "My name is John Kufuor, and I'm going to be the next president of Ghana." Whoa. Now, what would you do if the first person you met in the country said that I'm going to be the next president of Ghana? I mean, my first reaction was, "Oh my God, the first person I meet needs a wacko."
Yeah.
What am I going to do with this? So I'm making nice and I'm doing my best to pull away from this guy. And I finally do as other people arrive. But all through the evening, he's eyeing me. All right, fast forward 2 years later, in the year 2000, Ghana holds its presidential election. And John Kufuor is running against the chosen candidate of retiring President Jerry Rawlings, who himself took power in a military coup in the late 70s and was now reaching the end of his constitutional term limit as an elected president. Kufuor beats Rawlings' chosen candidate handily. And after we go to the inauguration, the inauguration is held at Black Star Square, which is the main square in Accra overlooking the seafront. After he delivers his inaugural speech, the American delegation, headed by the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Nancy Powell, our ambassador, Dee Robinson, our section heads at the embassy, and which include myself as the aide director, we are the first foreign delegation asked to come in to offer our congratulations to President Kufuor. So we go in, and his aides introduce the Deputy Assistant Secretary, they introduce the ambassador, and then we are allowed to introduce ourselves. When it comes around to me, I say, Mr. President, my name is, and he puts out his hand and cuts me short. And he says, I know exactly who you are. I told you I was going to be president of Ghana, and you didn't believe me. The room erupted in laughter. The ambassador turned crimson. Deputy Assistant Secretary Powell, her mouth kind of hung open. And President Kufuor, after a delicate silence, began to laugh like crazy. And he took my hand again in both his hands. And he said, we must talk. We must get together and talk about our plans for Ghana's development. And it turned out that during my remaining 2 years there, he and I met about every 4 months. We developed a friendship. We actually shared a massage therapist. Wonderful gentleman, actually, and really was a tremendous friendship. We talked about personal things as well as professional things, and he wrote me a beautiful letter when I left Ghana, which is something I cherish to this day. I did see him one more time in 2004 when I went back to inaugurate a project that the U.S. government had been supporting, and I addressed the sort of congregation of people who were attending the inauguration of this project. I started out using the local language, and as he came by to greet those of us on the stage, he came up to me, looked me in the eye, and he said, "You did come back." So, I mean, he's just a wonderful man, and sort of, I guess, really the most positive, memorable person that I ever met. And he just happened to be the president.
Is he still alive, Frank?
Yes, he is. Yes, he is. He's actually become sort of a Pan-African diplomat, somebody that has been used by the African Union to kind of get involved in some of the most more difficult political issues on the continent. He's sort of a retired diplomat in residence, if you will, but yeah, he's still alive.
Oh, what a cool story.
That's a great story. I mean, just think how it could have gone if instead of everybody laughing, if there'd been this silence that went on forever and ever. It's been like slinking out of the room. But that's a great story. So he turned out to be just a terrific guy. That's wonderful.
Indeed.
So, hey, Frank, I have a tough question for you. Do you think America still portrays the same image today as it did, back when you were in your heyday, that kind of a thing? You think we're still the country people want to emulate, or has things changed?
I think when I started out in my career, it was a much simpler world.
Mm-hmm. No internet.
Well, not only no internet, but generally foreign relations involved government to government. And there were a few large multinational and multilateral organizations like the World Bank, the UN, the IMF. But it was a much simpler world. It was a bipolar world, and the choices were pretty stark in terms of what type of country you might have wanted to emulate, not just culturally, but in terms of economic opportunity. You didn't see floods of people trying to emigrate to the Soviet Union, but you certainly saw floods of people trying to emigrate to the United States. Our large Indian American population, for example, is one example of, I think, of that. Even though India politically was more, I would say, aligned slightly more to the Soviets, Indian emigres would generally favor coming to the United States. After the 1990s, the world got a lot more complicated, and we got a lot more complicated. We were very active in promoting democracy and the principles of democracy overseas, and yet we were struggling with flaws and problems in our own democracy, which made work that I did abroad and work that my embassy colleagues did abroad a lot more difficult, because how do we preach to other countries how to adopt principles of democracy when we ourselves are struggling with it so hard here at home? And of course, our explanation is democracy is a work in progress. If you don't keep working on it, it's going to fall apart. You have to keep earning it day after day, year after year, because of the nature of the beast. And sometimes that rings true, sometimes it doesn't. But countries now have more options. The Chinese have made significant inroads in terms of getting countries to view the world through the type of optic that they prefer people view it. The Chinese, by the way, have the largest foreign service in the world. Last year, the year before, they outstripped us in terms of number of people deployed abroad in their foreign service. So they actually have a bit more throw weight than we do, although theirs is focused on trade and investment. I don't think many people emulate the Russians these days, but we are more now of a multipolar world, and the actors out there are no longer just state actors. There are a lot of non-state actors and transnational state actors. When I started, we didn't have a Gates Foundation, for example, that is now very active in such important issues as pandemic health. We have more than just the World Bank. We have regional lending institutions now. The African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, although the Asian Development Bank did exist when I was a junior officer. But we have such a broad array of non-governmental organizations and non-state actors all advocating for different issues, that managing these relationships are now becoming far more complex than it was when I joined. So the United States in some ways is competing for attention for our viewpoints with these other actors. But on the other hand, there's no other country in the world that I know of that has the convening power that the United States still has to bring countries together to address critical global issues such as climate change, such as pandemic health, counterterrorism, drug interdiction, and so forth. We are still looked to exert and exercise leadership in those and other critical areas. So while it's become more complex, we still have some degree of throw weight.
As I listen to you on our 150th episode, I hope the people in Washington, D.C. hear you speak. That is, you are so spot on that if anybody listens to any of our episodes, it should be this one, because you're absolutely right. Your perception of this, with the whole concept, all the stuff you do, you speak with authority, you speak with experience. I'm really, really, really pleased to be part of the Two Old Bucks and have you talking to us. What do you think, Dave?
Oh, absolutely agree. That's why we want to have Frank back. He's got a lot to say, and he's got a lot of experience, and he's interesting. Yeah, if I can turn the dial a little bit more, Frank.
Yeah.
Could you give us one or two more examples of some of the people you've met? Any people that we might know that are some among your most memorable people?
Yeah. Do you know which actor made the most James Bond movies?
Oh, geez.
Sean Connery.
No, he
Hmm.
made 6.
Okay. It's the English guy. No, I guess I don't.
Okay. It was Roger Moore. He made 7.
Roger Moore. Okay.
Roger Moore. And I met Roger Moore in Ghana when we were doing a polio eradication campaign. And he had been convinced by Audrey Hepburn to become the polio ambassador for the UN. I mean, he was trying to figure out what to do in his post-acting career, and she leaned on him to do this. He came to Ghana, and he sat with a number of us on a stage in a dusty soccer field. And in order to promote polio inoculations, he actually administered drops on the tongues of young children that had been brought to the soccer field to be vaccinated.
Nice.
And the man was amazing. He was dressed as you would expect a British gentleman to dress. Double-breasted blue blazer, white pants, tan shoes, a red handkerchief in his pocket.
It was perfect.
He was perfect. And he was incredibly farsighted. When he had his glasses on, his eyes kind of exploded behind the glasses. It was very blind. But he gave the rest of us gave our set speeches from pieces of paper. He stood there at the podium and he talked from the heart, completely off the cuff. And what was amazing about him, when he stepped out into the field to go administer the drops to these children, people crowded around him because they wanted to actually get close to and touch James Bond.
Yeah.
That's who they thought he was.
Yeah,
was
who
James
wouldn't?
Bond.
Jeez.
And he was getting so crowded in this hot, dusty field. People were just descending on him that I grabbed his arm and I pulled him toward me and I said, "Mr. Moore, we're about to reconvene for the closing remarks. I think I need to take you back to the stage." He looked at me with this semi-panicked look on his face and he said, "Oh, thank you." And we walked back to the stage. And as we got to the stage, he turned to me and the head of the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, and he said, "You know, I don't quite understand what you do. And I really don't understand how you do it. But please never stop.
Keep doing it.
Keep doing what you're doing." And I mean, he just really touched me. And I just thought the man was amazing. My least favorite person was Ferdinand Marcos.
Well,
who-
tell us about Ferdinand. And
Yeah, I met him in Imelda when I was a junior officer in the Philippines. And in 1980, there were rumors he was seriously ill. And he was. And a group of us attended a disco party at Malacañang Palace, which is the palace where he ran the government, and he and his family also live. It's right on the Pasig River in central Manila. And we were waiting in his library in Malacañang Palace. The furniture was all this Louis the 14th or Louis the 16th fancy French furniture. The walls were dark mahogany. And the one thing I remember about that study that we were in, waiting for him to come down, was he had a Nakamichi stereo system, which, if anybody knows anything about those old style stereo systems, the Nakamichi was the top of the line, thousands of dollars. And so we waited for him, and we saw this figure starting to come down the stairs, his hands grabbing the arms on the balustrade, and he took it step by step, very gingerly. But when he got to the floor, he walked as briskly as he could and came into the room, and we measured this guy, and a lot of us were shocked. His face was just completely ballooned, very swollen. His eyes were almost slits. And anybody who knows anything about prednisone knows that if you're taking that drug, that's one of the things that can happen to you. Mm-hmm. And the rumor was that he was suffering from kidney disease, but it was clear he was on some sort of medication. But he said to us, "See, I'm healthy. Everybody's talking about the fact I'm dying. There's completely no truth to that. I'm doing just fine. Let's go dance." And so we walk into an adjoining room to a discotheque that had been built within Malacañang Palace by Imelda. We weren't the only ones. There were a lot of embassy officers there because we were celebrating the visit of an all-star US basketball team. And he didn't dance at all. He kept sitting at the table. Imelda danced with everybody. And she knew who to dance with because she danced with the people that she wanted, obviously, to influence. About 2 a.m., his aides literally pick him up out of the chair and almost drag him through a curtain, clearly back up to his bedroom. And the party didn't actually end until 4 a.m. Fast forward to 1985, of course, there was a People's Power Revolution where he was overthrown in a bloodless coup. The military, the police force, and even the Catholic Church turned against him. The cardinal of the Catholic Church, whose name was Cardinal Sin, by the way, went on a radio broadcast to basically urge him to resign. I was the Philippine desk officer in Washington at the time, and when the tanks started rolling down the streets, we were all called up to the 8th floor of the State Department, to the Operations Center, to monitor what was going on. And what was going on was that he was being brought out of the palace in almost a catatonic state, being taken down the Pasig River in military boats that were also taking their personal effects, which included a lot of money and negotiable instruments and bonds and so forth. And this was all being loaded onto helicopters at the U.S. Embassy helicopter pad to be ferried to Clark Air Force Base, where he and his effects were going to be flown out of the country. The one incident here that stuck in my mind was that our aid director at the time, Fred Scheck, came on the open line that we had with the embassy from the ops center. And Fred was out of breath. And I said, Fred, what's going on? And he said, well, we're loading their effects on the helicopter. And I said, well, what's in them? You know, what are in the suitcases? And he said, AU. Everybody in the room looked at each other and they said, hey, you? And I picked up a marking pen, went over to the whiteboard, drew a capital A, a small U, and then turned to my colleagues and said, does anybody remember their high school chemistry?
Yeah, gold.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, as it turned out, they and the gold were not flown to his home province of Ilocos Norte, where he hoped to be, and run a counter government from there. They were flown to Hawaii, and the minute they got there, U.S. Customs seized the gold, the money, and all the rest of it. And long story short, he died a few years later of lupus, which was the reason he was taking the prednisone, which the purpose was to control the lupus that he had already been diagnosed with back in 1980.
Well, I'm glad you told us the ending there, where the U.S. seized all the assets that he pulled out. Because I was about to ask you, like, why are we helping this guy? He's a bad guy.
Yeah, we didn't get everything. I mean, obviously there was stuff scattered around the world, and Mrs. Marcos is still alive, by the way. As she's never been had to go to jail for anything. In fact, she went back and actually became an elected senator in the Philippine Senate. But yes, U.S. Customs seized what he actually brought out of country, but it was only a fraction of what he actually owned.
Huh.
Wow.
Hey, Dave, cue the James Bond theme, and we want to tell all our picks. Maybe a lot of people don't know that, so you might have heard that first right here on Two Old Bucks.
Great. Yeah. Boy.
I didn't know that.
What were your most difficult challenges you had? I know you just kind of talked a little bit about a couple, but
one was in Bangladesh, and I channel that one because of what we just went through in Florida with Hurricane Idalia. I went through a killer cyclone in Bangladesh. This is before they gave them names, back in 1991. It was the strongest cyclone in the country's history. Wind gusts of 300 kilometers an hour, which is off the scale. That's gusts. Sustained winds were Category 5 plus. And if you know your geography of the Bay of Bengal, it's kind of shaped like Big Bend in Florida, and then it's kind of a cul-de-sac. And so when a storm forms and begins to move toward shore, the first thing you got to worry about is storm surge. And that storm created a surge of approximately 20 feet that went 12 miles inland. And it killed 137,000 people.
Wow.
In the space of 45 minutes. The equivalent of dropping the nuclear bombs, the atom bombs on Japan in August of 1945. There were things we saw in the aftermath that one will never unsee. But the heroic end of this sort of was that 8,000 U.S. sailors and Marines deployed to Bangladesh for relief operations, basically to bring supplies to people who had been marooned by the storm. They took over Chittagong Airport and basically used it as a staging area for supplies in the southeast part of the country and southern part of the country to provide relief. We could not have done it on our own. We had an embassy very experienced in disaster response because Bangladesh gets visited by disasters on a regular basis. But this was something beyond anything we could do. And we were fortunate that there was a flotilla on the way back from the Persian Gulf in 1991. This was April 30th, 1991. And they were right at the mouth of the Bay of Bengal when the president told them to turn left and come up the Bay of Bengal and mount relief operations. And when I helicoptered out to the USS Tarawa with colleagues of mine to have lunch with those sailors, one of them got up and he was in tears. He said, we started this mission out of San Diego in late 1990 with the mission that we were going to go to the Persian Gulf to kill people and break things. And we didn't fire a single shot in anger. And yet we've come back and we're on our way back to San Diego, and we used everything on board that we had to save lives and rebuild. And that was an incredibly moving moment. The whole experience was searing, but if there were a moving positive moment that came out of that, it was watching the work of our military as they came to the rescue of a country and basically rescued the country. The other one was in Ghana, and this was more personal. Shortly after my family and I arrived in Ghana, we had this thing that we would always give medical exams to the people who work with us in our household. And we had a cook. It was necessary to do that because you had to go to the local market and buy things on a daily basis, and it wasn't something that we were familiar with doing, and so almost everybody had someone who could cook for them. And in my situation, because I gave a lot of official dinners, having a cook was important. When we gave our cook her medical, she came back HIV positive. And we had a choice here. Well, actually, I didn't think we did, but it was a choice. Do we let her go, or do we keep her on and monitor her health and let her continue to work? The embassy physician recommended that we let her go. But my wife and I, and this is where my wife, Pat, her counsel was just so valuable. She said, how would it look if the aide director let his cook go because she was HIV positive, and AID is running one of the largest HIV/AIDS programs in Ghana? How do you think that would look on the front page of the local paper? And she was absolutely right. On the other hand, if we kept her on and it became known that we had somebody in the household who's HIV positive, I would never have been able to have official functions at the house because odds are nobody would attend. So we had to keep this a secret for 4 years. And my 12-year-old son, Alex, and I really give this young man a lot of credit. We told him, and we said, Alex, you got to keep this a secret. You have to keep it under your hat. And you have to not be afraid, because she's not a threat to your health. And he did. And this was his education on HIV/AIDS at a very young age, but he kept this as the family secret. He socialized with her. They were in the kitchen together. He had no fear. It was an amazing act of maturity on his part. The sad end to all of this, she still had not turned into full-blown AIDS by the time we'd left, which was amazing. But she was later, after we left, she was later killed in a bus accident on the way back from her village in the Ashanti region of Ghana. And so, she never really got sick, but regrettably ended up getting killed in this bus accident. That was something difficult we lived with for the whole 4 years. You guys probably are the very few people that know this, and your listeners will be. Very few people in my agency ever knew. I never told my bosses about this, because I didn't want to have them be put in the position of knowing that something like this was going on. But we felt that was keeping her on was the only right thing to do.
That was a courageous decision, man. Hats off to you. Absolutely.
Indeed.
Man, man.
Indeed.
I'm going to ask you one more question. I've got one comment here, Frank. We've had you on twice now, and here's the problem I have.
Yeah.
I have a whole lot more questions. We won't have time.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to ask you back again someday. We're not going to make you come back so soon, unless you want to, of course. Just tell us a little bit about what retired Frank is doing. How does Frank spend his time today? And then we'll kind of wrap it up. And I'll put my list of questions with the other list of questions that I didn't get to ask you yet.
Well, retired Frank is trying to look after his health for the most part. I try to walk 20 to 25 miles a week with my neighbor. I joined a number of discussion groups. There's our group at the Ringling, the special interest group that Bruce.
That one.
Yeah. I'm part of a great decisions discussion group that is run by the Foreign Policy Association. I've given a few talks around town on Taiwan, since I spent 1.5 years living in Taiwan before I joined the Foreign Service in the 70s, at a very politically delicate time in that country's history, and that could be a whole other broadcast.
Yeah.
And so I'm giving talks about Taiwan, talks about India. In fact, on November 21st, I'm talking to the Bayfront community in Vemo on India then and now. What was India like when I was there in the late 60s, and how has it changed? And the fact that India's just landed, become the first country to land a craft on the South Pole of the moon, makes that talk, I think, all the more prescient.
Yeah.
So I've been doing that, and mentoring foreign service officers overseas for AID, and I'm on the board, past president, and now just currently on the board of the Foreign Service Retirees Association of Florida, which is the largest association of its type of retired foreign service officers in the United States.
So you're not really retired. You're really busy.
Yeah, not really.
Oh, man.
Well, thank you for taking time to visit with us. I'm telling you what's the truth.
Yes.
Well, thank you. It's great to talk to you guys again. I really enjoy these conversations.
Well, we really do too, and I know our listeners do. We got a lot of good feedback from the last one, and I'm sure we'll get the same thing here. So having said that, thank you very much, Frank. This is Old Buck Dave. I'm still Old Buck Dave, saying thanks, and we'll talk to everybody next time.
And this is Old Buck Dell saying, talk to you next time.